Good evening, everyone. I'm Louise Mirror, New York Historical Society's president and CEO, and I am thrilled to welcome you to tonight's virtual program, War, How Conflict Shaped Us. Tonight's program is presented as a part of our Bernard and Irene Schwartz Distinguished Speakers Series, which is the heart of our public programs. Just before I introduce our speakers, I want to recognize and thank several New York historical trustees who are joining us this evening. First and foremost, the chair of our board, Pam Schaffler, the visionary chairman emeritus of New York Historical, Roger Hertog, the chair of our executive committee, Richard Reese, and trustees, Brian Kane, Suzanne Peck, Jean Reed, Cy Sternberg, and David Zelaznik. I'd also like to thank members of our Chairman's Council who are joining us this evening. We are so very grateful to each and every one of you for your encouragement and support, especially at this challenging time. Now then, we are very pleased indeed to welcome Margaret MacMillan, Professor of History at the University of Toronto and Emeritus Professor of International History at the University of Oxford. Dr. MacMillan previously was on the faculty of Ryerson University before going on to serve as Provost of Trinity College at the University of Toronto and Warden of St. Antony's College at the University of Oxford. She's the author of War, How Conflict Shaped Us, which was published this past fall, and her previous books include Paris 1919, The War That Ended Peace, Nixon and Mao, Dangerous Games, and Women of the Raj. Joining us as moderator this evening is Philip Bobbitt, Herbert Wechsler Professor of Jurisprudence at Columbia Law School. Professor Bobbitt is a leading constitutional theorist who has an extensive history of government service. He served in all three branches of government during 6 administrations, both Republican and Democratic, including most recently as Director of Intelligence Programs, Senior Director for Critical Infrastructure, and Senior Director for Strategic Planning at the National Security Council. Tonight's program will last an hour, including 15 minutes for questions and answers. Your questions can be submitted via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. In the interest of simplicity, we've disabled the chat function, so please do remember to use the Q&A. Our speakers will get to as many questions as time allows. And now it is my great pleasure to turn our virtual stage over to tonight's speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise, and welcome, Margaret. Lovely to see you.
Thank you.
You say war is the most organized of human activities, whereas a constitutional lawyer like me might have said that governance is the most organized of human activities. And I mention this because the relationship between war and the emergence of the state is one of the great strengths of this wonderful, really gripping book. You add, a need to make war has been the driver for government organization. And I wish you just expand on that a bit.
Well, we may have to, a pleasure to be here. I just wish it went virtual. I have very happy memories of the New York Historical Society. I think we may have to argue a bit about which is the most organized of human activities, because I think war and government are so closely intertwined. But what I mean by it is that when you think of what's needed to make war, the mobilization, not just of people, but of resources, the control of those resources, the control of the people, the disciplining of those you want to fight, the direction of often very large numbers of people, this seems to me to take tremendous organization. And as you pointed out in your book, The Shield of Achilles, this has driven ahead, or certainly drove ahead, the organization of states, that it became necessary for states to acquire greater and greater power, partly in order to fight wars, but of course, the more successful they were in wars, the more powerful they often became. And so I've always thought it's very difficult to say which comes first, war or the high level of organized states, because I think the two really are intertwined and one tends to drive the other.
That's excellently put. You also say that government organization persisted in peacetime, that the need to monetize resources and create structures for which war was required, that these do not disappear with the end of war. Are you suggesting that there's been a kind of mission creep for the state and that we should roll back some of the powers of government that are gained of necessity in wartime?
Well, we give, I think, in societies, particularly democratic societies, considerable authority to our governments, and we will give up freedoms during war. Perhaps as I think the COVID pandemic is, of course, not a war, although people use the language of war about it, but there's something similar here. We're prepared to accept limitations on our freedom to come and go as we wish, because we understand there is a greater good at stake and there's a crisis that we have to get through. And I think it's the same with large-scale wars, that societies will recognize the need for their governments to do things which they wouldn't approve of in peacetime, to control the economy, to direct labor, to make people do certain sorts of jobs, not allow them to move freely around, to use censorship. I think often at the end of wars, some of these are rolled back, but I think what happens, and I'm not saying there's anything malignant in this, but I think it's just sort of natural that once governments have achieved a level of control over societies, they begin to think of doing it for, using it for peaceful purposes. You know, the amount of money that governments began to take out of societies, which they would have thought was inconceivable before the First World War, by the end of the First World War had become something that they realized they could do. And then, of course, I suppose mission creep is not a bad word. The sorts of things that they could spend the resources they were getting out of society on in peacetime seemed to be very desirable. And so I think often governments will go part way back to the pre-war situation, and societies may go part way back. But the tendency, I think, is for the authority and the powers taken on by government to persist after the war is over, because you can find many other and often good purposes to use them.
Yes. You've said that war is one organized group fighting another organized group using violence to get its will over the other organized group. And I think you may have said that this sometimes might include gang warfare, or perhaps some have said organized crime syndicates. This suggests that you don't need a state for there to be war. But there are many who say that war is a legal relationship between two or more states and are quite intolerant of the idea that you can have a war and not have a state. Our dear late friend Michael Howard maintained that at one point.
Yeah, and I'm very sympathetic to that, and I sympathize very much with that point of view, but it seems to me if you're trying to get at the essence of war, and we all have different definitions, but I was trying to distinguish war from random violence, the sort of brawl you might get at a football game or at a Canadian hockey game. You know, this to me is not organized violence, although there's often, as you know, quite a bit of violence involved. And what I'm also trying to get at, and I think it was Hedley Bull, the English political theorist, who said this, that organized groups who make war have some sort of thing that keeps them together. They have some sort of political goal. And I would say there's a blurred line between large-scale gangs, for example, who will often use criminal methods and often make their money out of crime, but who might have more political purposes than just making money out of crime. I mean, I think we saw the same thing in Northern Ireland, where the two sides, the hard men on both sides, who were fighting on both sides, slipped over into criminal activities, but they had a larger goal in mind. So, but what I was trying to get at was this notion that you're organized for some sort of purpose, and you're trying to do something with whatever force you have. And that's not just so you can sell more illicit goods or take other people's illicit goods.
Right. Margaret, you acknowledge that there's some broad historical factors, demography, geography, technology, plagues and epidemics that are not altered, or at least not transformed by political decision-making. But in this book, you write so powerfully and so winningly about the historic and cultural consequences of war. Suppose the Persians had defeated the Greeks at Salamis or Marathon. Suppose Charles Martel had been defeated at Tours by the Moors, or the Ottomans had successfully stormed Vienna, or, as you say, the Spanish conquest of the Americas had failed. Could you expand just for a minute with this broad sweep you give the reader on how wars have altered the course of history, these pivots that have changed the place we are at now?
Well, it's a very good question. Of course, as you know, it's something that historians argue about a lot. Is history the deep moving currents that flow well under the surface, or is it what some people would say is the froth on the surface. But I think there are times when you can see that war actually, the outcome of war does make a difference. I know we have to be very careful of counterfactuals and what ifs, but I think you just raised some. I think Europe would have been different. The Americas would have been different if there had been different outcomes to the war. North America might have been different if the British had won the War of Independence rather than losing it. There might have been a much bigger British North America, which included Canada as well, and perhaps would come to include Mexico. And so I think we have to recognize that the outcome of particular wars can determine, often for generations, sometimes even longer than that, religion, political organization, who dominates. So I think to say that war is really just on the surface and doesn't change things very much, I think I'm more on the side of saying that you can see with certain wars that if they had ended differently, the world would be different.
At several points in this book, you refer to the mystery of war, its incredible intensity. Perhaps part of this is the idea to which you refer that if you can die at any moment, every leaf matters. Why does war bring out the best and also bring out the worst in mankind? Is it simply a matter of risk and risk of harm?
Well, I think, there's a debate about whether we are, as a result of evolution, prone to violence. But I think you could equally argue that we're prone to altruism. And I think you see both in wars. I mean, I think in wars, and you get this in the memoirs of those who fought in wars, which I haven't done, that they have never felt, not everyone feels this, but you do get people saying, I have never felt such comradeship as I felt in a war, that I was with people I would die for, and I knew they would die for me. And you don't usually get that sort of feeling in civilian life. I suppose firefighters, first responders might have that sense. So I think it's one of the things that we puzzle about. It also brings out the most awful and bestial side of human nature. But I think because it's so complicated, I think, I'm not saying this is admirable, but I think we're attracted to war. We find there's something about it that we wonder about. And I think down through the centuries, young men and perhaps sometimes young women have said, could I do it? They've wanted to measure themselves up against it. It's seen as a test. And, if you, in certain cultures, I mean, certainly the culture that produced the Iliad, war was the supreme test for men. And it's something, why do people do it? I think we keep thinking about it, but there's also, as you mentioned, that intensity of experience. And I think, Tim O'Brien, whose novel I admire enormously, the things they carried, gets at that. Mm-hmm. But, suddenly, as you say, every leaf stands out. The sun is very bright. You feel life just as you're about to lose it or possibly about to lose it.
Yes, it was Robert E. Lee who said, it is good that war is so terrible, lest we fall in love with it.
Yeah.
This is a rare book that addresses the question of gender in the history of warfare. 99.99% of warriors, I suppose, in history have been men. Yeah. Are men the warriors of cultures all over the world at all different times because they're bigger, stronger, have more endurance? Is this a matter of evolution? And then I have some other questions about that, but let me just ask you first, what do you think is the source of this?
Well, as you know, the debate over evolution is a very long one, and I'm not sure we're anywhere near settling it. And I'm not sure that mere physical strength necessarily matters that much. And there is a spectrum. There are women who can be as strong as men, but at either end of the spectrum, there are probably men who are much stronger than most women will ever be, and there are women who are weaker than most men are. But I do think a lot of it has to do with culture. That if you grow up in a world in which you are brought up to think that you have to be brave, you mustn't show pain, you mustn't show fear, you must be prepared to follow orders and if necessary die. If you are brought up in a culture, and most cultures over time have not always, but have tended to that, it's always been men pretty much who've been at the receiving end of that sort of those sort of admonitions and those sort of expectations, whereas women have been expected to be the nurturers and to stay home. But I think we know that when women do fight, they may behave with each other differently and they may react to war differently, but they do fight with as much courage or as badly as men can do. Svetlana Alexievich's book, that wonderful book about Soviet women in the Second World War, about these young Soviet women who went off to war, and they didn't just stay behind the lines and do support functions. They were guerrillas, they were snipers, they were bomber pilots, they were fighter pilots, they manned artillery brigades. So, I think it is possible to argue that women simply haven't fought as much because of the culture of the societies out of which they've come. But I suspect that is changing, certainly in the United States. Whenever I've gone to lecture to people in the military, I've noticed just how many women are there, and they are in combat roles. They're not just doing things like, logistics or things necessary things behind the scenes.
Well, technology will facilitate this transition.
Yeah.
And women have often been recorded as motivators of war, the Sabine women, as objects of tactics. You mentioned the Serbian rapes of Bosnian women. But I have to ask about the Amazons.
Yeah.
I certainly hadn't realized that there is a good deal more anthropological, or at least physical anthropological evidence for the existence of the Amazons. Would you just say a bit about that?
Well, one of the fascinating things, and I learned this as I was doing the book, is that archaeologists and evolutionary biologists can now tell much more about ancient skeletons, and they can actually manage to get at ancient DNA, which simply wasn't possible, say, 20 years ago. And tombs have been found around the north shore of the Black Sea, which contain skeletons which show the marks of trauma. It looks like they've been killed in some sort of violent struggle, often buried with armor. The metal bits at least will survive. Of course, the leather and whatever else is made out of natural substances will disappear. And they are women, and have been identified as women and have been given warriors' burials. And a number of Viking women warriors' graves have also been found, and it's now possible to identify those skeletons in a way that it wasn't possible before. And so it really does look as though women have had a role in combat down through the ages, but it's been, as you pointed out, a very, very limited role. The expectation has not been that women will fight.
I'm going to try and keep this away from my 6-year-old daughter. She already has Amazonian tendencies. You remark, as we got better at killing, we got less tolerant of war. And I think there's little question that the nuclear posture of the Cold War kept it cold among the great powers. I'd just like you to discuss this. Is war a thing of the past for the Northern Tier countries?
I don't think it is. I don't want to predict because, historians are usually hopeless at predicting the future. But it seems to me that we have tended to assume that war is a thing of the past because for most of us, we've never experienced it. And I grew up in the last days, I was born in the last days of the Second World War. So I grew up in the aftermath of the Second World War in a peaceful country, Canada, and I never saw a war. And very few Canadians did, unless they went overseas to fight or unless they came from countries that had experienced war. And so I think we've got used to the idea in a very large part of the world that war is something that if it happens, happens elsewhere, but won't happen to us. But as you know, before the First World War, a lot of Europeans thought that. They thought war is not something we will do ever again. We're too civilized. It's something that others do. And I think you never know until you feel threatened or until something happens. I mean, I don't know how many people were isolationist in the United States before 1940, but I would say possibly a majority. It was
most, yes.
Pearl Harbor changed all that. Americans who said they would never fight were lining up to volunteer.
Does our aversion to violence today, if it's true and there is less tolerance for body bags and the casualties of war, does this mean that we in the Northern Tier states are more vulnerable to extortion by violence?
That is a possibility. Yes, I think it's a very good question. I hadn't really thought of it, but I think that is a possibility. The enemies of countries like the United States know and calculate, and ISIS has often made statements to this effect. The Americans cannot bear the pain of losing soldiers, that eventually they will give up, and we just have to make it so painful for them. And I think that is a lesson that guerrilla groups who fight, I mean, they're much weaker than the United States, but the one weapon they have is using public opinion in the United States and the world and turning that against the United States itself. And I think it is true that we are very reluctant now to see the young in our societies go off and fight. I mean, I was doing a comparison the other day of how many British soldiers have died in Afghanistan, or military have died in Afghanistan. I think you probably know, but it's something around 1,400. 20,000 people died on the first day of the Battle of the Somme,
Right.
and it was accepted. I don't think we accept that anymore, and I think that's actually a very good thing.
On average, in World War II, counting civilian and military deaths, 16,000 people died every day.
Yeah. It would be unacceptable today
No.
for us, but it's still happening around the
Unimaginable.
world. Yeah.
Simply unimaginable.
Yeah.
How important, Margaret, is it that the generations who've grown up now, our generation, those of my students and yours, have not served in the armed forces? The draft ended in the 1970s. I think it was a giant step towards a different sort of constitutional order. I wonder, what are the conditions, if this is inevitable, as I believe it is, of walling off the experience of service in a democracy?
It concerns me, and I think it should concern us all, because what we don't want to see is a military caste or people we expect to go and fight for us, and we don't feel they're ours. And I think, certainly in Canada, I think there has now been a public outcry, but I think for a time we weren't doing enough to deal with the veterans who were coming back from Afghanistan and help them readjust to society. And I think that's because so few of us knew, or partly because so few of us knew any. The other thing that worries me about so few people having military experience now is that those who lead us, most of them have not had direct military experience. And I think if you haven't experienced war firsthand, you may be more casual about going to war. And it strikes me that those political leaders in the period after the Second World War who'd been to war were actually very cautious about going to war because they knew what it was like. If you've never been to war, you may think, oh, great, we can do this. So I do think, I think it may be bad for societies.
There's an annual dinner in Washington I used to go to. It's given by a print journalist, well attended by politicians. The president always gives a humorous talk. And at the beginning of the dinner, the band plays the various anthems of the services. And the veterans stand up during this playing. And as the years have gone by, I've watched a time when almost everyone stood up.
Mm.
And now it's very rare to see someone stand up during those anthems.
Yeah. No.
You point out that the armies of the 18th century were composed of very badly treated and poorly regarded common soldiers, led by aristocrats creating the very caste you just mentioned. And you say that a removed caste was also bad for those that it elevated. The Praetorian Guard of Rome, the Janissaries of the Ottoman Empire. Why should we be wary of an isolated military class? And are we moving in that direction with the end of conscription?
It's a good question. I would like to say I hope not, but I think the danger of having a military caste is that they can begin to see themselves as somehow at odds with the rest of society, that they're not understood, or that the rest of society is soft. I mean, I think that was very much the case in Germany before the First World War, where the military had an elevated status in Germany, but also felt they were special. Yes. And felt that they were above politics, that they were truly the guardians of the German nation, and didn't feel any need to do what the political leadership wanted, and didn't in fact inform the political leadership often of what it was they were planning. And I think this can be dangerous. I mean, I think in democratic societies, I think we understand just how important civilian control of the military is. And I think we should want a military that is part of our society, not something that is seen as separate and sees itself as separate.
Margaret, I used to give the opening lecture at the National Defense University to a couple of hundred colonels and brigadiers. And I would ask them, is victory in war the defeat of the enemy? And they would pretty generally all agree that it was. And then I would say, no, that's victory in football, or maybe victory in chess. Victory in war is the achievement of the war aim.
Yeah.
Do you agree with this? And if you do, is the reason we failed to achieve victory in Vietnam, in Iraq, and Afghanistan because our war aims were unrealistic, or because our tactics and methods were inadequate?
I think it can often be both, that you're trying to win a war with methods that simply don't suit a particular terrain or a particular type of struggle. But so often in war, and you see it throughout history, people will go to war, nations will go to war, groups of people will go to war, thinking once we've defeated the enemy forces, that's it. And they don't really think about what happens next. And they don't really think about how to achieve a lasting peace. I mean, St. Augustine said the purpose of war should be peace. And I think he's right. But I think the danger is that in focusing on military victory, there's a very good book by Cathal Nolan called The Allure of Battle, where he talks about this fixation throughout much of history with winning the decisive battle. But often the decisive battle doesn't actually settle things. And it's having a plan for what you do when the enemy is ready to talk and what it is you hope to achieve. And I think too often nations or groups of people go into wars without really thinking through what it is they hope to achieve and what they want. And of course, what you also get is the longer and more costly the war becomes, the more the war aims expand.
That's right.
Because you want to make up for the sacrifices and the losses.
Yes. Cicero famously said, as much of our audience will know, inter arma enim silent leges, which is to say that in warfare, the law is silent. Do you agree with this? I sense a certain skepticism in this book about the laws of war.
Well, I think we keep trying, and I think we ought to keep trying. But it seems to me there is this extraordinary thing that we're trying to control something that is always in danger of becoming uncontrollable and is about the use of violence and is about going all out to win. But I think it is a credit, actually, to humanity that we keep on trying to limit the effects of war, and we keep on trying to say, you must not use certain kinds of weapons, or you must not target certain kinds of people. The attempts down through the ages in a number of cultures to try and protect the innocent, to try and protect women and children, to try and protect those who are not causing any harm, I think is absolutely right. But the temptation always is when a war starts, is to throw the respect for the laws out the window.
Well, you mentioned Francis Lieber, who was a Columbia law professor. He drafted a military order number 1 during the Civil War that is the basis for our code of laws of war. And for this, he's much honored. But the American Civil War also saw the first appearance of total war in the modern era as a strategy replacing the decisive battles of Napoleon and the imperial states. Do you see a relationship between the effort to impose laws of war, as Lieber and Lincoln attempted, and the creation of a doctrine of total war that Grant and Sherman initiated?
I suppose the 19th century is, as you would know better than me, a century when there is an attempt to make laws in a number of areas, and there's an attempt to regulate society. And that may be driven in part by a sense that society was becoming too complex. And in the case of war, its means of destruction were getting too great. What also happened, I think, in the 19th century, and it certainly has happened in other times and other places, is that the distinction between those who were actually doing the fighting and those who were supporting them got more and more blurred. General Sherman said, we must make the South feel what it means to go on fighting. And that means the women and children and burning the factories and burning the farms and making it impossible for them to survive. And I think, so we see on the one side, this attempt to legislate and to make laws, which we see in other areas of society. I mean, this is an age of great lawmaking, particularly in advanced industrial societies, but we also see this blurring of the line because society and wars are getting more complicated and often lasting longer. We see this blurring of the lines.
Would you discuss, just for this audience, which I think will be keenly interested in your answer, the movement in the United States and to a lesser degree in the United Kingdom away from the teaching of diplomatic and military history in the university?
Well, I'm concerned about it. And I don't quite know why it's happened. It's also happened in my own country, Canada. In history departments, there is a swing away from teaching international relations, even though the students want it. I mean, the single most popular undergraduate course in first year at the University of Toronto, where I'm attached to the history department, is a course called Strategy and Statecraft. It's overwhelmingly subscribed. But the department, I think, is a bit leery of it because they're not quite sure what it's, I don't know. I think that they're concerned about it. And history has been moving, and as it should, in a direction of taking in new subjects and looking at the histories of groups who have not been written into history, for example. And I think this is important. But because international relations and because war can have such a profound effect on the lives of people in different societies, I think we need to be aware of it. Unfortunately, I think the study of war has come to be seen as sort of toys for boys, people talking about tanks and talking about regiments. And that's not what I think war is about. I mean, Michael Howard, who you mentioned earlier, always said that he was studying war and society. You know, he wasn't studying military history. He was studying the history of war and society.
Yes.
And it does concern me because I think those who are going to lead us in the next generations need to know something about war, need to know something about international relations, because for sure they're going to have to deal with issues at least involving those.
To return to our theme of the mutually affecting relationship between war and the state, Hegel wrote after the Battle of Jena that history had ended. This was picked up, as you know, by Frank Fukuyama, by which Hegel meant that the dialectic that produced history had ceased with the triumph of this intensely nationalistic imperial state. I gather you would agree with this because you give a riveting description of the Battle of Valmy, and you quote Goethe in something I want to read for our audience. Goethe writes, "From this place and from this day forth begins a new era in the history of the world, and you can all say that you were present at its birth." Would you just describe what he was writing about?
Well, the Battle of Valmy was actually one of those historical events which doesn't deserve, I think, all the attention and symbolism loaded onto it. It was a clash of arms between the French revolutionary troops in 1792 and invading forces from the Ancien regimes, who of course wanted to strangle the French Revolution as soon as they possibly could. And the forces coming into Germany, I think they were Prussian and Austrian, you can correct me, were turned back, or at least didn't come any further as a result of the resistance of the French revolutionary soldiers. Mm-hmm. And the officers of the more traditional forces were horrified because the French revolutionary soldiers didn't seem to know how to behave. They rushed across the field, they sang revolutionary songs, their order was terrible, but they were very hard to withstand because they didn't stop and fire in neat ranks. And I think what Goethe meant was that a new spirit had taken hold. There was a new motivating force among soldiers, and this was nationalism, not for all peoples, but it was certainly a very powerful force in the 19th century and is indeed in some parts of the world today. It's like an ideology. It is an ideology. It's like a religion, or it's like wanting to build a utopia on earth. You will fight and die and kill others for the nation, this abstract concept. But I don't think history came to an end because, as we know, the way we organize ourselves changes, the way we fight changes, technology changes. We live today in a very different world from that world of the beginning of the 19th century.
Absolutely. And in large part because of the ensuing wars. Yeah. You write very interestingly about the relationship between Herbert Spencer and social Darwinism on the one hand, and imperialism and racism on the other. How did war play into this?
Well, how we think about ourselves and how we think about others, I think, affects the ways in which we behave. And what social Darwinism was, in retrospect, a misapplication of Darwinian ideas about evolution and adaptation to human societies. And it was assumed that a human society, something called the French race or the British race, which we know is nonsense anyway, impossible to distinguish in any meaningful way. The argument was that they are like species in nature. And so if the French were like bulldogs, the British were like poodles, or the other way around. And they were distinct species. And it was, and then this whole idea of adaptation and survival, the survival of the fittest, this very dangerous concept that only those that adapted and were prepared to adapt would survive. And this became, in social Darwinism, a moral imperative, that if you weren't prepared to fight for yourself, you didn't deserve to survive. You should be swept away, and stronger and more vigorous races should take over. And in some, not all, but certainly in some writings, in the minds of some, this became racist, that there were some races so defined in this way, which were inferior and therefore deserved to be swept aside by the more vigorous races. They didn't deserve to survive. They hadn't got the moral right to survive. And that did help, I think, to fuel the imperialism of the 19th century. The Europeans went out around the world, as they hadn't done so much in the 18th century, with a tremendous sense of self-confidence, that they were a superior race and that they had every right to do it. And of course, in a funny way, the poorer the country you came from, or the less significant the country you came from in Europe, the more important it was to have an empire. Tiny Belgium, the King of Belgium, was bored with being king of Belgium, and so he acquired the whole of what became the Belgian Congo. But it was a way of sort of showing that you counted.
Yes. If today culture in the northern tier countries are moving towards more devolution, more multicultural identities, certainly greater individual autonomy, and if this is our future, two questions about war immediately arise. Who will be willing to fight for such a state when there's no cohesive national identity? I was driving my son back from a tennis camp, and he said, if war broke out, and where I got this idea, if war broke out, would you go to England? Because I still spend a lot of my time in Britain, or at least I did before the pandemic. And I said, well, I might very well send you and your mother there, but no, I'd want to stay here. And I told him about Alistair Horn and people you and I have known who were sent to America as babies during the Blitz. And he said, why would you come back? And I said, well, Pasha, this is my country. Mm. It seemed like just a natural reply. I wonder when he's grown, if his contemporaries would have such a sentiment. And if they don't, would they be willing to risk their lives and their fortunes in war?
Well, I mean, I would make a distinction, which I think George Orwell did, between patriotism and nationalism. And nationalism is this often unreflecting and sometimes racist sense of yourselves as somehow bound by these mystical ties and superior to others. But patriotism is, I think, simply, and I can't remember Orwell's words, saying, you know, my country's not such a bad place, and it's a decent place, and I'd like to defend it. I don't want to see it taken over by someone like Hitler and the Nazis. And so, yes, I will fight for it. And I think the ingredients of that sort of patriotism needn't depend on a shared ethnicity or even shared cultural values. There has to be some sharing. And I don't know, we'll have to see what happens in Canada, because we have moved way beyond being a sort of offshoot of Britain and France with a fair admixture of the indigenous. We've moved into a much more multicultural society, and it's something that Canadians are proud of. It's become an ingredient in what it is to be Canadian, just as our public health system is an ingredient in what it is to be Canadian. So it may be that groups of people develop other reasons for feeling loyal to the group beyond nationalism.
Well, I won't press you on this, but your answer makes me ask myself whether people will be willing to fight for a country whose history they've been taught to despise. Well, but let me go on to something else.
Yeah, we could talk a long time about that.
Particularly these days. Steven Pinker has advanced the thesis that we're becoming less violent as a species. I'm skeptical about this myself, but as I say, I live with small children, so violence is more or less constant in my life. If he's right, what are the implications for war? Might we turn to drones and artificial intelligence as a way of hiding violence, or will we actually become pacifist?
I don't know. It's very hard to predict. I mean, I think there is a distinction to be made between, and Pinker talks about how societies, particularly in the developed part of the world, the fortunate North, have become less violent. They're less willing to tolerate things like public executions or spectacles like bear baiting, and we're less willing to tolerate violence in the streets. Even when I was young, it was not unusual to see people fighting in the streets, I think, in ways that you wouldn't perhaps as much now, except perhaps in Northern Ireland at the moment. But whether that means we're less likely to go to war, I mean, I think what the individual feels like and what violence the individual is going to commit is not war making. And I think one of the things that the military do is spend an awful lot of time working out how to turn ordinary people, civilians, into those who fight. I mean, that's why there's so much training and preparation. So, you know, I think training, inculcation of values can make a huge difference in the willingness of people to fight.
All right, one of the marvelous things about this book is your discussion of how organized violence begins in the human community when hunter-gatherers were replaced by agricultural groups. Will you just expand on that for a moment?
Well, it's highly speculative, and I think, you know, it's happened so far back that we probably don't we won't ever get definitive evidence, but it seems to me that with hunter-gatherers, and we know that among hunter-gatherers, or I think we know that there actually was a fair degree of violence. People did kill each other. This view that people lived in some sort of Garden of Eden, I think, is not realistic at all. But once people settled down, I think a number of things happened. One is they were able to produce a surplus as agriculturalists, which meant that not everyone had to work on the land. Not everyone had to take part, as they did in a hunter-gatherer society, in gathering and preparing and killing the food that they were going to need. And it became possible to have class differentiation. It became possible to support an upper class, scribes, and military. But also once people settled down, of course, it was more difficult to pick up and go away. You couldn't, as you could have done if you were nomadic, simply say, there's trouble over the horizon, let's get out. They won't chase us. You couldn't pick up and go away as easily. And so you had to begin to build walls. And some of the earliest human settlements, they have found remnants of walls around. And of course, the more organized and well-to-do particular groups became, the more they were targets of those who want to attack them, the more they were capable of attacking others. And so I think the more organized we became, to go back to your earlier point about the coexistence, what's the word I want, the co-development of organization and fighting, I think goes back a very long way.
That's fascinating. I wonder now about the future, and I will just end with this question, and then perhaps we can go to the audience, which I know is anxious to ask their own questions. Going from our ancient past to the near future, and the prospect of deploying robots and drones in the battlefield, do you think we will build robots that have conscience-driven algorithms that will allow them to do the right thing despite the risk of their destruction? Or do you think we'll build robots that will act more ruthlessly and decisively than human beings, when men and women would cavil at some act?
I think it depends very much how we program them and what inhibitors we build in. And there's a considerable debate at the moment about whether autonomous weapon systems, which of course can include the next generations of robots, should have ethical standards built in or not. And I think there's a lot of resistance to having any sort of barriers built in, because would it make them less effective? But the danger, as we know, is that, especially as artificial intelligence develops, that these may begin to program themselves, and they may get out of our control. And we also know there are problems with programming that can go wrong. We've seen enough of that. So, you program a robot and say, don't do any harm to women and children, so the robot will go off and kill everyone else. It's not a good example, but I think I'm worried about the way war is going, particularly at the high-tech end.
Well, this is fascinating, and it's an exercise of maximum self-restraint that makes me adhere to this 45-minute deadline so we can go to the audience. Now, I'm suspicious of modern technology because I'm so inept at it myself, but I think I've mastered at least this part. Here are some questions. How has compulsory military service in the US and abroad affected nationalism and public opinion?
Well, one of the side effects of national service is that it can often make people more patriotic. When the German army, before the First World War, first started training large numbers of men, often from the working classes, the poorer classes in German society, the military upper ranks were very concerned. They said, we're putting a gun in their hands and they'll turn it against us. And in fact, what seems to have happened is that even quite left-wing workers, members of trade unions, for example, who did their military service became quite different as a result. And so often military service was a nation-building activity, depended again on the country. What also seems to happen, and I think it's a good thing, is that if you do military service, if you have something like a draft, you can be, and often are, thrown together with people who aren't the least bit like you. And I think that's actually good for a country, for people from different parts of the country and different classes and different types of people to have to get on with each other. And there are a number of sort of military memoirs that say, often upper class officers or officers from privileged classes saying, I never really talked to a working class person before. And, they read poetry and they have ideas, this sort of bewilderment that in fact others who they didn't take seriously as citizens did have their own wants, desires, personalities. So I think it can actually be quite a good thing.
The same questioner asked from the dark side of that. Based on your observations, have you found there to be a link between compulsory military service and the frequency with which a nation engages in armed conflict?
I think it depends very much on the nation. So I don't think I would draw a direct link. A number of countries in Europe had compulsory military service after the Second World War, but there has been no major state-to-state war in Europe since 1945. I mean, the Germans continued to have, at least for a time, compulsory military service. The Swiss did, but I don't think it leads in itself to war. It often, I think, simply leads to a greater appreciation of those who do their military service of the country.
One person asked, there is a general consensus, at least in the United States, that veterans should be cared for and supported by their government. Is this a new idea? How has the experience of veterans changed throughout history?
Well, it used to be in many armies that they were simply discarded. They had no pensions. No one worried about them. Kipling's poetry is very good about this. Tommy Atkins, they need us when they have a battle, and then at the end they don't give two cents for us. But I think gradually, as the idea began to spread that people in a country were not just subjects of a ruler, but citizens of that country, governments began to see that they ought to do something. And so if you've ever been to London, the Chelsea Pensioners Hospital,
sure, of course,
was established to look after old and indigent and often sick soldiers, ordinary soldiers. In France is La Charité in Paris, which was established for very much the same sort of thing. And so by the 19th century, I think in a number of countries, particularly the countries that could afford it, there was a sense that you must do something for those who had fought for you and suffered for you.
Another person asked, what links do you see between war and class? For example, in who fights wars, who dies in war, or other considerations from your research?
Again, I think it depends often on the nature of the society. And so in very hierarchical societies, where those at the top actually, in some cases, depend on their military strength to maintain their power, they don't want anyone else fighting. In the Middle Ages, the knights in armor at first were very reluctant to use foot soldiers, or very reluctant to have archers on the ground, because they feared for their own dominance. And of course, their position on a horse with their armor gave them tremendous power and tremendous authority. But I think, again, as I said, it depends on the society. You will get societies in which only a few people fight and they come from a particular caste. But in democratic societies, those who fight will often be ordinary people, because they're fighting for, or they see it, for their own society. I mean, those who went off to fight in the First World War were by and large, I don't think, fighting for abstract concepts like the Tsar or the Emperor or the King. What they were fighting for was their homes, yes, and their wives and their children.
There's a beautiful image of Czesław Miłosz when he describes the original Lithuanians confronting a Teutonic knight on horseback. Yeah. 7-8 feet high with this huge metal carapace, and he compares it to seeing a tank.
Yeah. It would have been absolutely terrifying if you were. But once they learned how to deal with it, if you stand firm and start shooting at the horses, you can do rather well.
How would you characterize foreign meddling in U.S. elections? Should we be calling this an act of war, cyber espionage, or something else entirely?
It's such a new area, and it's such an interesting question, isn't it? I tend again to have this rather narrow definition of war, but there's always these gray areas. And I think war is moving into this new area of cyber war and cyberspace. It doesn't involve direct combat or the direct clash of forces, but it can often involve as much damage and as much destruction and as much loss of life as more direct conflicts. So I think, the ways in which states or sub-state actors use cyber attacks to cause maximum disruption, I think can be seen in many cases as an act of war. And we know that it is possible, at least, for hostile forces to do things like turn off power grids,
Right.
you know, and the damage from that, or, you know, destroying dams or making it impossible to have water purification plants, that can be absolutely enormous. So I would regard it as an adjunct to war, but an increasingly important part of war.
Another question is, with the exception of genocide, opposing sides in armed conflicts throughout history typically designated portions of the population off limits.
Yeah.
What are the origins of this standard of decorum? How did it evolve over time?
I think we don't know for sure, but I think part of it may have been, again, to be embedded, may have been embedded in the values of a particular society, that a society where women and children were revered as the progenitors or the future of the society, meant that killing them, both, you know, your own being killed and killing others, was a very dreadful thing to do. But I think there was also a feeling that those who filled certain functions should be protected. Priests, for example. I mean, in many cultures, those who are priests have been exempt from being attacked, or in theory, exempt from being attacked. And also, I think there was always a utilitarian motive here. You didn't kill people who might be useful to you. And so in the Middle Ages, you tended not to kill those who were farming, because you knew that they were going to produce the food that you needed, even if they belonged to someone else or were on someone else's land.
Fascinating. Another question is, how has the advent of social media determined how conflicts are sown and fought and how fighters are recruited? In your opinion, does it get too much credit in propelling movements like the Arab Spring, or not enough?
Well, we know, I think we're just coming to terms with the power of social media, and we know that people recruit themselves, and they now have the means to do it. I mean, it is not a new phenomenon. The assassins who killed the Archduke at Sarajevo basically recruited themselves by reading Serbian nationalist tracts and by reading the works of anarchists, and they modeled themselves on other successful assassins. But it was much more difficult in those days, and their sources of information were not as instantaneous and as widespread as they are today. And so I think we do face a real problem with people who will recruit themselves, or who'll find conspiracy theories which will encourage them to regard those as enemies who are not enemies at all. And I do think this is a problem. The other way I think social media is affecting war is that increasingly, for a lot of countries, wars are fought under tremendous spotlight, tremendous amount of publicity. And part of fighting war now is to make sure that your story gets out and the other side's story doesn't get out. I mean, I think one of the things that has caused such trouble, or did cause such trouble for the United States in Vietnam, was the coverage of the war, which reached people at home and made them come to the conclusion, or made many of them come to the conclusion, this was not a war they were going to win.
Yeah. I think your readership has expanded far beyond this wonderful new book. I infer that from this question. One of the audience wants to know, could there have been another outcome to the Treaty of Versailles if it had been written differently? All of you know that Margaret MacMillan has written this amazing book about the negotiations of the Treaty of Versailles. Tell us, what do you think?
Well, you know, I think when I wrote the book, and I maybe would change my mind now, and we always should be open to changing our minds, I looked at what they were actually dealing with. And I thought, how much freedom did they actually have, the major statesmen in Paris? They were dealing with a Europe that was shattered. They were dealing, they thought, with a Germany that had been defeated on the battlefield. And I think it's now conclusive for whatever the German high command said, and many Germans believed in the 1920s and 1930s, Germany was defeated in the First World War. It asked for an armistice, but it was in effect a surrender. And if you read the terms of the armistice, it's a surrender. So what could the Allies have done to make things better? What they could have done, of course, is be much more generous to Germany, but that was politically very difficult indeed. You know, if you are living in France and you know that the whole of the north of your country is devastated, which contains, you know, something like a third of your industrial plant, villages, towns, mines, railways, all destroyed, and often destroyed deliberately as the Germans were leaving in the summer of 1918, are you going to say, well, let's be generous? And I think Clemenceau, the French prime minister at the time, didn't think he could. He said, I will have to face my middle classes. And being a Democratic politician, he was thinking of the next election. They might have been wise to be gentler with Germany. But, you know, I don't know, because you look at the end of the Second World War, and Germany was treated much, much worse. It was divided. It was devastated. The Soviets took huge amounts of reparations out of Germany, but we don't hear today, do we, how very unfairly Germany was treated. So I think part of what went wrong, to give a very short answer, after 1919, is a failure of politics in a number of countries and a failure of the international system. I still think it might have been all right if it hadn't been for the Great Depression. But I think that's when things really turned very bad indeed.
We're coming almost to the end of our time, so I'm moving on to a different question now. In the coming decades, what issues do you see igniting new conflicts? And what parts of the world should we be watching?
Well, I think, and Philip, you may disagree with me, I think we still may see state-to-state conflicts, or the potential for state-to-state conflicts. India, Pakistan, you know, they have fought, I think, 3 times now. They both possess nuclear weapons. India and China, they've fought once, and there have been skirmishes indeed recently along their common frontier up in the Himalayas. And of course, the United States and China. And I'm not saying these are going to happen, but these are certainly possibilities that people are beginning to contemplate. They may be wrong, and I certainly hope they're wrong. But I think what we're also going to see is a lot more conflicts, as we're seeing now in failed states. You know, where governments, for various reasons, states that were wobbly to begin with, never built a strong infrastructure or strong political structure, which often were destabilized by outside forces. I think we're going to see more of those. I think we're going to see more Syrias and more Somalias and more Yemens. And that worries me.
Well, to return to the point that we began with, there is a large body of opinion in America that strong states drive themselves towards war, that when you give the state more power, you take power away from the individual and from the civilian society. My own feeling is that that may not always be true, and that if you want to prevent war, don't count on a weak state. The weakest states are the most vulnerable states. But I say this as a sort of prejudice prelude to this, maybe our next to last question. Do you think increasing defense budgets increase the likelihood of war?
Not necessarily. I think it depends what you're spending it on. I think often with defense budgets, and there's been some interesting commentary on the US defense budget recently, there's a piece in the New York Times today, actually, about how these budgets take on a sort of inertia and the military just keeps spending, and they don't really sit down and say, do we need all this? And governments don't sit down. Sorry, I'm gonna, this is not COVID. I think this is just Oxford blossomed. But, so I think there's a danger. There's always a danger, I think, when you have an arms race, that the side that feels it's falling behind may be attempted to do something silly.
Margaret, this has been a wonderful evening, and we are so grateful to you for coming. And as on a personal level, of course, it's wonderful to see you. And I hope we're all reunited somewhere, sometime soon.
Thank you. Well, I apologize for my cough, but thank you all. And I wish I were in New York, but there we are. And
we wish you were too.
Thank you for all those lovely questions.
And I'll say good evening to Louise Mayer and Dale Gregory and all of our friends in New York.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you. Thanks for coming. Thanks for these wonderful questions. And again, thanks to our tremendous author.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.